All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, a new Politico article seeks to tackle the future of the post-Bernie left and what exactly his loss means for the future. The headline reads, "Progressives thought they'd overtaken the Democratic Party. Now they're in despair." They're not wrong, honestly. That despair, peppered with some rage, is certainly the prevailing sentiment I've seen within the anti-establishment left. I don't really like the term progressive because to me it encompasses a lot of firm party loyalist Warren types who are perfectly comfortable with or actually enthusiastic about the increasingly affluent and identitarian direction of the Democratic Party. I also don't like the term the Bernie left because it implies dependency on one political figure, and as some in the mainstream press were shocked to realize we do actually have minds of our own. The article includes quotes from various left operatives and activists, some of whom seem more in touch with reality, frankly, than others do. There's an understandable grasping among some to see the movement as still powerful and deeply relevant. Sanders' campaign manager, Faz Shakir, falls into this category, telling Politico that, "I do believe progressives are in the ascendancy in the Democratic Party, and we are still in the midst of that transition," pointing to Biden and other Democrats who've embraced progressive policies far to the left of where the party was a decade ago as evidence of the left's expanding influence. Now, I want to believe that. I want to buy the idea that Biden's task forces really mean something and the fact that Medicare for all is a majority position really means something, but I don't. Instead, I see a movement that was on the cusp of actual victory mere moments ago and is now crushed and defeated. Last week's embarrassing flailing with the HEROES Act to bail out corporate lobbyists with some window dressing around supporting our frontline heroes is a perfect case in point. First off, of course, there was a normal disarray and complete lack of communication. Pramila Jayapal was understandably upset that the primary progressive priorities around healthcare and payroll were not included. Others felt that after going along with leadership for several lackluster efforts, it was time to actually show a little bit of backbone. Meanwhile, many outside progressive groups apparently didn't get the message, coming out in favor of the bill. Jayapal and Pocan, co-chairs of the Progressive Caucus, decided to make a move, but when they did, it was exactly the sort of tepid, warmed-over resistance that we've come sadly to expect. A letter asking not even for any specific changes, but for a pause to assess the bill. They didn't get their pause. They didn't get their priorities. They only mustered 14 votes on the rule to consider the HEROES Act. Some of them were actually from moderates who were worried about the deficit, I suppose. And in the end, Jayapal was the sole progressive to vote against it. Does that sound to you like an ascendant movement? At a moment when corporate Democrats are sending talking points to the media about how big they want to go and how Biden's an FDR-style revolutionary, the caucus with the proposals most up to the scale and scope of the times has been rendered utterly politically irrelevant. Now, obviously, it pains me to admit these things and to watch it all unfold. I'm not looking to be unduly pessimistic here, but I do believe in honesty, and I don't think you can move forward if you don't have an accurate picture of the present. The left isn't just anemic and in despair because it's perpetually disorganized or because they're licking their wounds over a political loss. It's also not just because this is an incredibly depressing historical moment that we are all living through, although that certainly doesn't help. I think there are really three pieces here to think about. First was the way in which Bernie's loss occurred. Now, I just watched this Bernie Blackout documentary, which is well done. It is somewhat torturous to relive all the ups and downs of the incredibly abbreviated primary. But most painful was to watch all of the hopeful energy and optimism and organizers and workers sending in their $10 and students knocking on doors and the willingness to believe that things could be different, that things could be better. To actually invest their emotional energy and then watch as someone who barely campaigned had the waters parted for him by Obama and an overwhelming media propaganda narrative. To be so close to having a shot at real change and then watch it all crumble in record-breaking time from a massive coordinated establishment effort fed a sense that the project not only failed, but was perhaps doomed from the outset. Second was the way in which Bernie bent the knee. Now, it was one thing to watch Bernie get out of the race prematurely, in my view, when he could have stayed in longer to gain more leverage and provide a viable alternative should additional questions and credible allegations arise regarding Joe's past. It was another thing to watch Bernie's cringeworthy live stream with his friend Joe and see all the people who hated him and trashed him and would have gone to any lengths to stop him come out with all of their faux praise. But the real killer was to see Bernie actually chastise his supporters who were not ready to climb on board with a candidate who doesn't share their values or their view of politics. Now, I understand why Bernie views the landscape as he does, and I really do believe that he thinks he is acting in what is national interest. But in that moment, not only did it seem like the project was potentially doomed, it appeared that the revolutionary rhetoric had been just that, rhetoric. And now the revolutionary was trying to sell us on the transformational change of some task forces, seemingly abandoning his legacy of unvarnished truth-telling to be just like all the rest, willing to sacrifice every principle and 40-year-long ideal in service of beating Trump, fully buying into the lesser of two evils framework that leads to endless hell and the fundamental impossibility of real change. After all, why would the corporatists offer anything better if they can just be slightly better than the bad guys? They weaponized Bernie's basic decency to become a tool of crushing his own movement in a way that, frankly, he alone could do. Finally, there is a deep sense of impotence in the face of a crisis where the forces of corporatism instantly leapt into action and won all their most important priorities, while the left meekly protested in a tweet or a live stream or an occasional floor speech. We get that the moment is now, and that the agenda we believe in is exactly what was called for at this time. And yet the movement that could have fought for that agenda is defeated by the establishment and then demoralized by its former leader. Our inability to take action further hampered by a necessary separation that keeps us from physically gathering. Let me end this rather depressing explication on a hopeful note, though. It's stupid to think that an ideology which is growing in acceptance and which came within moments of the presidency is irrelevant or dead or any of that. That's not true. The present may be a moment of despair in seemingly blocked paths and barred doors. But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that the moment can shift quickly, and that the forces of corporate greed can't help but overreach. Another moment of action and possibility is coming. Let's learn and let's be ready. And Sagar, on that piece, we already see some of the stirrings of that in talks about a general strike and some of the work actions that we're seeing in talks of a rent strike. But I do think that there is this sense of depression that is worth digging into, like what are the root causes of that? Because if you don't understand that, then you're delusional and you don't know how to move forward.
Yeah, of course. And look, self-criticism is the most important thing, especially in the wake of failure. I've also been thinking about this too, which is that if you look at the bailout package and what was successful and what was not, I saw a couple of people were tweeting about this yesterday. They were like, you know, it's crazy. Like the most effective wings so far in terms of getting what they want have been the establishment Dems and establishment Rs.
Yep.
But in terms of outsider movements, the only people who've gotten anything into legislation, not a lot, maybe 5%, were some of these more populist Republican senators. And there's a real question as to why exactly that is. And what I've settled on is that you have to believe in two things to get something done. You have to believe in politics and you have to believe in government. So on the right, the establishment Republicans believe in politics and they believe in government.
Yeah.
But they use and believe in government to corporate ends. The populist people believe in politics and government, are on the right, believe in using government for more worker-centric ends. So they got some of what they want. Now, who are the people who are irrelevant? The progressives and the libertarians. Libertarians because they don't believe in government. Progressives because they don't really believe in politics. And I think that is actually what it really comes down to, which is at the end of the day, and what I mean when I say don't believe in politics is this fake trying to whip votes against the bill, this whole like only being able to muster 14 out of a necessary 18 votes, only one person ultimately voting against it, being completely unable to organize any sort of caucus that holds, look, here's the other, I think we were talking about this. Why is the Congressional Progressive Caucus like 100 people?
Yeah.
That's essentially meaningless. That's almost half of the entire Democratic caucus.
Right.
It's much
and
better
some of them are apparently also members of like the New Democrat Caucus, which is the corporate caucus.
Yeah,
like,
somebody riddle me that one.
That doesn't go together.
Right, so what you should do is what the Freedom Caucus was, very tightly controlled. It was like 30, 40 people, but they were staunch believers in things, and they actually had enough actions in order to force leadership's hands. That's politics. They didn't believe in government, but they believed very strongly in politics.
I think I don't know if I would say don't believe in politics, and maybe this is what you mean. I would say that they don't understand who their enemies actually are.
Well, that's part of politics.
Right, and that is part of politics. We talked to Dan Marins, a great reporter for Huffington Post, who has, real insight into the dynamics of the Progressive Caucus. And he talked, some of these people are just not progressive by any metric. Like, if you're in the New Democratic Caucus and you're in the Progressive, you are not a progressive. Some of them, though, are more of the model of like Elizabeth Warren, where, in an ideal world, if you ask them their issue set, they're like progressive on the issues, but they're also very, very loyal to leadership. And that trumps any of their like so-called values, which to me, then your values are sort of meaningless because you're just going to go along with whatever the like corporatist leadership wants you to do. And that is the overwhelming majority of the Progressive Caucus. You have only like a tiny handful of people who even think about crossing leadership and dissenting. They are not clear, and not just those dissenters who are more anti-establishment, but the ones who call themselves progressives. They don't understand who their actual enemies and adversaries are. You can see it playing out right now with Elizabeth Warren. Like, she has this fantasy where she's going to be vice president. You're not going to be vice president because even you just holding those views like somewhere deep inside where they're barely ever let out to actually have an impact in our politics, even that is too threatening. So you see James Carville saying, maybe we should make you like attorney general, so that's not going to be a problem. You see the Biden campaign flitting, well, it'd be an issue because we need her in that Senate seat, and it could be a problem getting another Democrat elected. She tried to play the game and view these people as her friends and as a team player. You see this with Katie Porter, same thing. Sure. She'll level like the meekest, most tepid, vague, you have to like read in between the lines criticism of leadership like it's a big deal. And what ends up happening is like the only people who actually notice is leadership, so they're mad at her.
Right.
So they see her as the enemy, but no one else even notices because she won't say Pelosi, she won't say Schumer, she won't come right out with it. And so I think that is part of it, is that there has been an overwhelming loyalty to leadership that is not remotely reciprocated in another direction. Like, leadership is very clear. The Democratic establishment is very clear that anyone, not just who would challenge their power, but anyone who even holds an anti-corporate ideology is their enemy. But the people who hold that ideology don't seem to understand that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I mean by politics is exactly that, which is understanding power dynamics and how to accomplish what you want, which is ultimately, if you're not willing to go up against leadership and you're only willing to pay lip service to something, then you don't really believe in actually getting and using power in order to accomplish the ends of which you told your constituents. That's ultimately your job, and especially as a political leader. This is what talked about earlier with Bernie Sanders, which is that always being, trying to have it both ways, being the anti-establishmentarian, being a member of Democratic leadership, being the guy who's going to go against the Democratic establishment, and being the guy who says, yeah, I think Joe Biden could beat Donald Trump, and I'll vote for Joe no matter what. These are fundamentally irreconcilable things, and the establishment always wins if you're going to be able to give them that. So you have to only be able to go up against them and actually practice politics if you want to get something done. And I just think so much of it is just like idealistic nonsense, speaking out into the ether and just play acting revolution. Like, that's just not how revolution actually happens.
You have to be willing to be villainized. You have to be willing to be hated. You have to be willing to stick a stick in the gears and make it all shut down and make people like absolutely furious at you. And going back to like the core of that despair, I think that many people on the left feel like people don't feel like the left is ascendant and it's just a matter of time before progressives take over the party. No, they feel crushed. And part of, and I think this is the part that is important, it's uncomfortable to talk about, but it is important to recognize, is part of why that despair exists is because the leader of the movement himself essentially said, you guys are wrong in your way that you're viewing things. Like, he turned around and chastised his own movement and said, no, lesser of two evils is the best that we can hope for, so you got to get on board. And so if even Bernie Sanders, like the most consistent politician in the universe, the most principled, honest politician that you can imagine, like if even he is saying that, then you look at that and you're like, well, where do I exist in this like spectrum? Like, name me one person that has power and influence in this town down who actually represents my views is going to fight for the type of politics and the type of policies that we believe that would make the country better. And so that's, I think, part of why it feels like such a dark moment on the left. Now, as I said, like, that doesn't last forever. That's this moment. Things change incredibly quickly. I mean, think about where we are now versus when Bernie was on the cusp of winning versus where we'll be in November or post-November after we find out what happens in the presidential election, after people sort of pick themselves up, after right now they're just like, you know, struggling to make it and survive and isolate and all of that. Once they look around and have a full reckoning of the just massive corporate bailout and exacerbating of all the worst trends in America, like, what does that moment look like? I don't know, but I think we have to do this kind of soul searching now so that we are prepared to take advantage of that moment when it comes.
It's going to be interesting.
Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That's next.